unlocking potential, sparking growth, driving performance. Because better leaders create a better future.
Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Assessment Chaos to Clarity, the right types for selection, succession, and development. A few housekeeping tips before we begin. You can find today's slides as well as related thought leadership in the resources section of your console. This webinar is being recorded and you will receive the link to watch on demand later today. The chat feature is open and we encourage your comments and responses, and we see a lot coming in already, so thank you. And to submit a question to our presenter, or if you have technical questions, please use the Q&A box. And now let's bring in today's presenter, Patrick Canal, DDI's Consulting Director. Welcome, Patrick.
Thank you, Kim, and welcome everybody. Really glad that you're here. As Kim mentioned, we see the chat is pretty active here. So far, I see folks from Wisconsin, Texas, Minneapolis, Mississippi, quite a few there. So we've got a pretty wide scope of where people are joining us. So again, welcome. The general theme is wherever you are, it tends to be cold, which I totally get that. We're excited to have you. This is a very hot topic right now. If you're joining us, it's probably very top of mind for you, given what you're driving within your own organizations. And maybe you're just new to this area around assessments and you're trying to really understand the landscape, or maybe you've had a lot more experience in this space and are trying to look for places you want to optimize the use of assessment in your organization. And so all of that is fair game for today and everything in between. So excited to dive in with these topics in particular. And as Kim mentioned, let's keep the chat active. I'm going to try to make sure I'm keeping a close eye on that. And we will have some time for some questions at the end as well. So make sure you jot those down as we're going through. I'm going to start us off with some bits of some research here. This is from our global leadership forecast. It's the biggest leadership study of its kind. And if you'd like to have more details around this, you can find it in the platform, and also you can find it on our website as well. But this is a quick stat that really speaks to the value that assessment brings, specifically from the lens of bench strength. And so, again, a lot of organizations are thinking about bench strength. You're probably in that category as well, and thinking about how they're using assessment, but also development as a way to strengthen bench strength across the pipeline in the organizations. What we found, and this is a consistent finding across other studies as well, is that organizations are twice as likely to have a strong bench when they are using assessment in the process. So in combination, usually with really effective development and pairing that with assessment as well. And this can be across all levels, all leadership levels within organizations. So why is that? What's the value there? And I like to use the analogy that when you pair assessment and development together, it's really like upgrading from a compass to a GPS, right? So you go from having some good, maybe internal feedback of where development opportunities are, leadership gaps are in your organization, but assessment really allows you to get very precise around where those strengths and developments are, and then to target your development efforts very acutely in those areas, which leads to better value and better ROI in those spaces. So it's a pretty powerful combination there. And again, it really speaks to the value of assessment in that process. I do want to start our discussion here with that as a backdrop, with hearing a little bit from you in this space. So we've got a quick polling question. Kim is going to help us out with this. So which of these answers or sounds most like you that aligns to where you are in your own assessment journey within your organization? So is it, I need to learn the basics about different assessment types? Or I want to start using assessments for our leaders. Maybe I'm knowledgeable about what the tools are, but I haven't started using them yet. Or I'm using assessments currently, but I want to explore new or better options to assess leaders. Okay, so just pick the answer choice that is most representative of where you are in that journey, and we'll get a sense across the group around where the biggest needs are. Okay, so we'll give you a few moments here. Kim has opened up the poll, so just go ahead and select that answer choice. We'll give you a few seconds to respond here. And as you're thinking about that, you can also expand on that in the chat a little bit. So if you want to provide some rationale for your answer choice, feel free to have that in the chat as well. All right. Kim, how are we looking response-wise?
We are looking good. I think everybody can see the results. So if you want to talk to that, it looks like a lot of people want to explore new or better tools to assess their leaders. So
great. So that would suggest we've got some knowledge around assessments, what some of those options are, looking to probably optimize in that space. We've got some folks too, or maybe just a little bit earlier on in this journey. So that's great. What we're going to do is sort of talk about some different categories of assessments, some of the most common that are found there, and then also kind of the pros and cons and where you want to use those. I'm just taking an eye on the chat here. So I'm from a few folks. So we currently use a lot of assessments in our organization. We're looking to revamp our strategy. Yep, makes a lot of sense. So what other options might you have? Also seen a few other things. I'm familiar with many types of assessments. I want to start using them in my practice. So what's the right choice for the right need? Great. Wonderful. Thanks for that additional clarity there. So we'll hit on a lot of those topics as we start to go through here. Perfect. All right. Well, when you're thinking about an assessment strategy, either you're building one now sort of from scratch or you're looking to optimize one that you currently have in place, these tend to be the most fundamental questions that you're probably trying to answer, right? So why an assessment? Why is this going to add value? How do I show value in the organization? Who do I want to target? What types of assessments do I want to leverage and to what end? And then how am I going to roll this out? How does it align with the budget that I'm either already have or I'm trying to secure? So all really important questions on that front. Today's webinar is part of a broader series related to these questions. And in previous webinars, which you can find on our website, we really dived into the why and the who. And so today we're going to spotlight the what. And this is really focused on those three questions that you see there on the screen. So what insights are needed? Right. So what data is most important to capture to drive the outcomes that you're targeting? What's the right type of assessment? So you've got quite a few options out there, right? Which is a good thing and a bad thing. You've got options, but it can feel a bit overwhelming sometimes. So which one is going to be the best fit for the needs in your organization, given your leaders? And then what's next after the assessment? The really insightful assessment adds a lot of value, but it's assessment for what, and then how are you going to leverage those insights? How are you going to translate those insights into action for those leaders in the right ways? So those are the pieces we're going to dive in today in just a little bit more detail around those particular aspects. This next visual, it's a little tongue-in-cheek, but it captures maybe how you might be feeling on this topic, which is, as I mentioned, sometimes a bit overwhelming, not really sure how to sort through the different assessment options that you might have. How do you know if there's a good assessment? What criteria should you be using? And that can feel a little bit overwhelming and complex. And so what we want to do today is help simplify that for you and provide, again, some criteria and also some examples here that can help you make those types of decisions. So let's go ahead and jump in here. When you think about assessments, and this may be familiar to a lot of you as well, they tend to fall into three major buckets. You'll see those on the screen here. So first we have perceptions, right? So how do I see myself? How do others see me, right? Trying to get a read on that aspect. Then we start to transition a bit more to objective assessment tools. And that's where this bucket of tests comes into play, right? So, and this is typically around areas like judgment and personality, et cetera. And then the final bucket is behaviors. That's what we're looking at, actual actions that people demonstrate, either related to their current role, maybe the role a level above that you want to get a read on their level of proficiency in those areas. So those are three main buckets that tend to define the landscape. And within those, you'll see some common players. This is not going to be an exhaustive list, but we tried to highlight the most common ones that fall in these categories. So under perceptions, these are probably not a surprise to you. Some of the most common types here are self-assessments and also 360 multi-rater feedback. Self-assessments can be really powerful. It's your own self-perceptions around where you see your strengths and development areas. It can be a really powerful insight as a leader is stepping into a learning program or a learning journey. For example, they walk in with some quick insights that already can help guide where they want to focus. And then 360s, which probably a lot of people on this session are familiar with, it gives you a holistic view of your strengths and development areas, both from yourself, your peers, your manager, etc. So it's very holistic. Under the test category, you'll see common assessment types that range from cognitive assessments, so looking more at judgment, decision-making, personality inventories that are more about innate, natural tendencies that tie to our personality strengths, potential derailers, our values. Personality inventories are a really good read on that aspect. And then also situational judgment tests, which that one may be less familiar to you, not as common as the other two, but a really valid tool in this category in being able to basically objectively assess, do people know the right behaviors to take or the right actions to take in common leadership situations or scenarios. So we start to getting into a read on behavior, but more from a judgment lens from that perspective. On the far end of the continuum is obviously that behavior category. And two major players in this space are interviews. So think about behavioral-based interviews that collect actual examples of behavior from candidates, applicants, or interviewees. And then simulations, which can range from quick and more bite-sized to very immersive and in-depth. And obviously the power here is you're getting a read on actual behavior, right? Not just what they're saying they're doing, but in the simulation, you get to see what they're actually doing and evaluate that behavior. So really, really powerful across the whole spectrum. We're going to be diving into a few of these in more depth here as well. I'm interested though in the chat if there's ones in particular that you tend to use the most often or you have the most energy around. We'll try to get a read on that as well. As you look from left to right, you're also probably noticing a couple of trends because there's two additional criteria that are really important as you think about the different types of assessments. And one of those is the depth of data or depth of insight that you're after. And that ranges from more simple with perceptions and some tools like self-assessments and multi-rated feedback, all the way up to more comprehensive, where you get a really rich picture around someone's behavior and their level of capability. And so there's different levels of depth that are associated with these different assessment types. That's a key decision criteria to keep in mind as you're thinking about which ones are going to best align to the outcomes that you're trying to drive within your organization. The other is around the leader experience, right, of going through these assessments. And there's trade-offs here, right, where sometimes based on need, you're looking for just a quick read on someone's capability or perceptions of their capability that's easy to administer, easy to execute, very simple from a candidate experience or leader experience perspective. But based on other types of outcomes, maybe from a succession perspective example, you want to take a deeper dive and you want to have a more robust experience, not only in terms of the data that would come from that experience, but also in terms of giving the leader themselves a real taste of what that role or that level of role is going to really involve. And so that's a more longer, more in-depth assessment experience for that particular leader. So those are two really important criteria to think about because they can help guide the choices that you make based on the needs that you have within your organization. I like to think of this as also like a menu, right? You think about the different types of items that you would find on the menu in a restaurant, and depending on your criteria or your needs for that meal, you may make different selections. If you're in a rush or you're not that hungry and you just need something quick, you might pick a salad or an appetizer, and that might be more on the perceptual side or a quick test to get at those pieces. But if you're really hungry, or you've got a couple hours to devote and you really want to enjoy yourself, you might pick something that's more robust from an entree, a steak, or a really delicious seafood dish, for example. And so that might be analogous to a more robust, in-depth simulation or more based of a simulation experience or something more in-depth like a strong behaviorally based interview. So you've got different options to play with there. We're going to highlight, as I mentioned, a few of these and double click down on some of the details here and some of the pros and cons associated with these. And I'm going to start with the one that's typically sort of the most common in terms of use and recognition, and that's 360 multi-rater feedback or 360 survey. We really recommend this to be used primarily for development. It's a great development lens that, again, is holistic. It gives you a read from not only your self-perceptions, but from the perceptions of others from multiple lenses, peer, manager, direct reports, etc. It is based on perceptual data. So that's why we have the validity level there is low, because it is perceptual data. It's not objective, but it's still a really good read on how that person is being viewed across different audiences. And it can, as it says here, highlight both maybe confirm perceptions that person has about themselves, but also can highlight some really important blind spots that might be at play. So it can be really powerful at the start of a learning journey or a learning program that leader is going to go through. They'll have a chance to walk in with some really good insight. It also is a really great way to kick off a coaching engagement, a one-on-one coaching engagement with some really good feedback. So there's a lot of good plays for this type of tool. Probably the biggest watch out when it comes to 360 is tends to be overused. So it's a little bit like sort of, I'm not going to do an Oprah impression, but it was sort of like, you get a car, you get a car, you get a car. It's like, you get a 360, you get a 360. It's based on whatever the need was. We'll throw a 360 at it because that's going to solve the problem. And so it's really important that's a really important caution to have, because it is really a powerful tool when it comes to development, but it can do a lot of damage if it's used specifically for things like a sole tool for succession, for example, or selection, because it is based on perceptual data only. And some of that data can be politically charged. It's only looking at current perceptions, not future readiness. So again, assessment for what is a really good question to have. And with the 360, it is assessment for development is that primary use there, given some of those watchouts. The next one I did want to talk to you about is personality inventories. Again, these also are quite common. They add a lot of value. They're an important data point as well. And they've got broad applications. So you can use personality inventories for development, also can be used in succession, selection. Our recommendation, though, is it is never used as a single data point in those applications, but as a data point paired with other types of assessment data, preferably behavioral data, okay? But the validity of these, depending on the tool, can be quite high. There's a lot of personality inventories that are well validated, that have been in use for a number of years. So there's really good validity that stands behind those, but it depends on the tool. So you got to do your homework on and ask for that validity evidence to be able to make sure this is a valid tool and there's data to back it up. One of the most powerful strengths behind personality inventories, though, is it gets at the why. It really lifts up the hood to explain why certain behaviors might be there, or why someone might be acting in a certain way and why they have certain tendencies. So it can really get under the hood around those aspects of it. And they can be really interesting from a succession planning perspective or long-term development, because it looks at sort of what is the orientation that leader going to bring to different scenarios, and what's likely to help them and be an enabler for them in terms of personality, and what are things that maybe could get in their way, especially as people progress into executive positions, executive roles where the scope is broader, the pressure is more intense, leaders are more likely to derail. And so what are those watch outs or those blind spots that need to really be on the radar for them? This is a common watch out for personality inventory, similar to 360, tendency for overuse or misuse. So you got to be really careful about, again, using it as a single data point, because just because I have certain tendencies in my personality doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to behave that way. And so that's why it's a really powerful combination, which we'll talk about in just a few minutes, of pairing personality, which looks at innate tendencies, pairing that with some read on behavior, whether that's a simulation or really strong behavioral interview. So you can compare the behavior to the personality, because depending on the level of self-awareness, you may see different behavior from that person. So personality inventories only tell part of that picture. The other caution I would point out is, again, these tools vary in quality. So do your homework. When an assessment tool has really good validation evidence, you show it off, right? Those companies are very more than willing to spotlight that data and talk to you about the validity behind it. When there's not good validity data, then you'll see some sidestepping. And so understanding what's the validity evidence associated with those personality instruments is key, because that can vary as you look across the market from that perspective. I'm going to transition us to one that I mentioned may be not as well known, but still adds a really important perspective here as an assessment tool, and that is situational judgment tests. These are basically tend to be online assessments that are scenario based, and they tend to be, for instance, common leader scenarios, typically frontline, mid-level scenarios. Think about having to coach a challenging direct report, for example, or having to influence or facilitate change across different types of stakeholders. So what it does is it allows the leader to reflect on what would they do in that situation. Specifically, can they recognize more effective actions in those scenarios versus less effective, right? So it's more about their judgment and decision making on what's the correct course of action they could take, which is a really good read on their leadership judgment. And there's a lot of pros for these. They tend to have strong validity behind them, again, depending on the type of tool. They are less influenced by education and socioeconomic and background, so there's less adverse impact concerns as opposed to like a cognitive ability test, for example, which looks at critical thinking. And a really good data point for frontline or mid-level selection, for example, also works for development also. The watchouts, as you see here, is, again, it's not looking at actual behavior, it's looking at judgment. So you need to take that into account rather, when you're interpreting the data. And in these types of judgment tests, what the person's doing is they're looking at options and they're deciding of these options which are the best and which are the least effective. So that comment about it can oversimplify complex leadership behaviors is true, because we're sort of laying out the options for them and they get to pick, which is not the case in real life, right? They need to come up with those potential options on their own. But again, it's a quick read and it tends to be a scalable type of assessment that you could administer across a broad population of leaders, specifically at the front line and the mid-level. Last but not least here, I'm going to hit on simulations. And again, think about that continuum again across the assessment spectrum. This was up to the far right. So more of the most in-depth type of insight that you can get depending on the type of simulation and the length. Good news is there's a wide number of applications for this. So development, succession, selection, all of those are appropriate for simulations. And the validity tends to be quite high here, depending on how that simulation was developed and validated. So some really good legal defensibility there too that comes along with it. As you mentioned here, this is really the gold standard. It tends to be your best read on behavior, because we get the opportunity to observe not what the leader or executive is telling us they would do, but what they're actually doing in that scenario, right? And based off that premise of the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior, we're getting a direct read on that past behavior, which can be really powerful. There's different types of simulations that can be leveraged across the leadership pipeline. We see a lot of simulations at the front line, the mid-level. We also work with a lot of customers around using executive simulations for selection or development within key executive roles or critical roles at that level, because the data is so rich and you've got a lot to work with from that perspective. You do have to be careful around a couple of aspects, which is they can be resource intensive. There's more time usually that's required from the leader or the executive to complete these assessments. So you need to take that into account. They do tend to be a richer experience. So the positives of that is you get richer data and insight on the back end, but that can maybe cause some nervousness and sort of anxiety for a leader and executive who's going to have to devote maybe 2, 3 or more hours. So setting the right expectations is really important. And not all simulations are created equal. So you got to really do your homework again on what's the insight you're going to get on the back end, and how does that align to the outcomes you're driving specifically in your organization. So that's kind of a quick walkthrough of, again, some of the most common assessment types. And a question you might be having too is, well, do I always have to use these on their own, or can they be combined in some way? And the answer is, actually, there is quite a lot of value in combining assessments. And why is that? Well, the payoffs are really in three main buckets that you see here on the screen. So you get one major advantage, you get cross-validation across different lenses of assessment. So you might be able to see something in, for instance, that's showing up in a personality inventory around a tendency that that person might have. And then if you include a behavioral assessment in the mix, whether that's a 360 or an interview-based assessment, you can validate, well, is that theme showing up in their behavior? So from another lens. So that cross-validation is a real advantage. It's more of a holistic view of that person's capability or tendency, so you get more depth and balance. And again, that leads better data leads to better decisions, right? So more is not always better when it comes to assessment, but the right combination of different assessments is a really effective way to make sure you're getting the right data to make those decisions. So that's a really important positive payoff there as well. Another way to think about it, this is kind of, again, tongue-in-cheek a little bit, but think about things in everyday life that are just sort of better together. They're good on their own, but when you put them together, it's like chef's kiss, right? And so that you can pick your favorite here on the screen. I'm actually kind of curious to see what people would put in the chat here. But whether you're a champagne and strawberries person, or classic peanut butter and jelly, or my personal favorite is the one on the right, which is like a milkshake or a Frosty, and then you've got the French fries in the mix. From that perspective, that is like killer combination from that aspect. And so it's that combination of that salty and the sweet. So again, a little tongue-in-cheek, a little bit of levity there. But the same goes to pairing certain assessments together as well. That combination can give you a level of insight that's really powerful in making the right decisions, and whether it's development, selection, succession, etc. So I want to give you a couple of examples of these that really bring that to life. And the first is from a development lens. And so not sure if we have folks on here joining the session today that have done a lot of maybe feedback sessions with leaders, whether that's 360 feedback or personality, feedback based on personality instruments, or the pairing of the two. But if you have, this combination can be really powerful. And why is that? Well, as it says here, the 360, you're going to get a read on behavior that's holistic, and that's a really powerful read on the what. What are the actions they're taking? What are the actions that people are seeing? But you also get a read on the why. So why might those certain perceptions be out there? What's driving that? What's driving the behavior that the leader's engaging in? And it's a really nice way to validate certain trends. Again, on that point around cross-validation, where you're maybe seeing in their personality instrument that maybe they tend to have a bit more of an introverted profile. And you're wondering, well, how does that show up for me as a leader? Where does that show up? In a 360 feedback, you can, that's a really good read around, well, how is it showing up? Is it something that tends to show up with their reluctance to build effective networks within their organization? Does that hold them back from getting things done? Or are they very aware of this as part of their personality, and they actively have worked on pushing themselves through that, so it doesn't hold them back in terms of forming the right networks internally or externally? So anyone who's done these types of session, this combination can lead to a lot of really important aha moments, right? Or I hadn't thought about it that way, or I haven't seen that aspect of myself, why that was happening, and showing up in terms of feedback from others. So it's a really powerful combination from a development perspective. The other combination that's pretty powerful is when you think about from a hiring or a selection lens. And that is where you can really combine a read on behavior. So think about like a simulation that would assess someone's actual behavior. You can do a really strong behavioral interview, which gets at what are the things they've done in the past or their background? What are strong behavioral examples that would give a read on their background and past experience? And then also pairing it with a read on critical thinking. That's the cognitive ability piece, which is really relevant for jobs that are also going to have more of a cognitive or complexity component to it. You want to see how they would navigate those types of decisions and what's their critical thinking skill in that area. But this type of combination gives you, again, a read on multiple lenses that would give you sort of 3 different areas to be able to see where are trends converging, where are some things maybe contradicting each other, and then how does it line for the needs of the role. So you're able to get more of a complex and cohesive read on that person's capability and what are maybe the strengths and watchouts, as opposed to just using one tool alone. The final area is around succession. And again, this is usually where organizations are going to make more of a specialized investment, especially at executive levels. So they're willing to use more of a robust type of assessment or simulation that's going to give more robust data on the back end. And that's where the pairing of a simulation, like a day in the life executive simulation, for example, which the executive would sort of parachute into common executive scenarios, and we get to see how they handle those, paired with personality, so a read on their natural strengths or things that could get in their way from a derailer perspective, and then pairing that with the 360. So that gives a read on perceptions, their current perceptions, and you could look at the comparison between how they're perceived versus how they would perform at the next level above, right? So succession decisions they can be really high stakes sometimes, right? Especially at the executive level. So you want to make sure you're mitigating risk as much as possible. And so that's where combining assessments that look at skills, but also level of self-awareness, but also feedback from others can be a really powerful combination there as well. All right. I'm just taking a look on the chat here. Lots of love for PB&J. I missed that earlier. I'm right there with you. Okay, perfect. Looks like this is tracking pretty well. All right, I'm going to close out with a couple of sort of final comments here, and then I want to make sure we've got some time for questions here, because I bet there's some things that are top of mind for you, given some of the information that's been shared. This is a sort of a cheat sheet, and the examples of the assessments that we offer, the DDI offers, that really hits on these major categories. And again, we really want to be prepared to offer our customer organizations a range of different assessments depending on the need and also the level of insight, the type of candidate experience that you're after. So that's why you see a number of assessments listed here. What we've tried to do, and you'll have access to the slides, as Kim mentioned, is just some criteria to think about in terms of how to use it, what is it best for, what's the level of objectivity, what's the type of data that I would get versus as an HR professional versus what will my leaders get. So this is sort of a one-stop shop to be able to start to sort through some of that data and those types of decisions as well. So you'll have this available for you as part of the slide deck also. And if you would like more detail around each of these, be happy, your DDI team or DDI representative will be happy to talk to you more about the different options here as well. As I mentioned, this is a really hot topic. And so we'll be diving into this in multiple sessions actually at our Better Leaders Summit, which is, coming up very quickly here in a couple of weeks. What you'll see is a snapshot of some of the different presentations that are going to be delivered as part of that conference. And if you are attending, we are excited to see you. If you have interest in attending, the registration is still open, so you can still find that link on our website. But we'll be diving into this topic across multiple sessions and specifically really uncovering and digging more into the power of integrating assessments with development. And again, how that helps you really elevate not only your focus for development, but also the experience of your leaders as well. So if you're joining, we'll be excited to see you. And if you haven't registered yet, we'd love to have you from that perspective. Okay, I think we have a few minutes left here. And again, that's a lot of information I know to cover and digest. It is a complex topic, but I think it's a really interesting one, and it's one that has a lot of potential too on where you could take it depending on the needs in your organization. So I think, Nikki, you've been capturing some questions for us, maybe off to the side. Maybe we can hit on a few of these
Yeah,
to round out.
we've got some great questions, and if we don't have time to answer all of them, trust that someone from the DDI team will reach out to you after the webinar. But I want to start off with a question that came in around, there's obviously a lot of excess and confusion, kind of struggling to go through all the different types of assessments. And this person is looking for a bit of a red thread, right? Like, how do you ensure that all assessment use and types are integrated and connected, yet still flexible for different business needs across the organization? Maybe looking for some advice around, how would you define or put in place some kind of a red thread across assessments for an organization?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think couple of initial thoughts, and then we can build on this. But you've heard me mention a red thread already is around assessments for what. So I think being really clear on in your organizations and with your stakeholders, you're going to be implementing assessments based on the outcome that you're driving for the business, right? And that outcome may look a little different depending on a particular business unit or a function. But the red thread is we're not just going to assign assessments because we know that people might like them or they might be engaging. Leader experience is an important criteria, but it's more about how is that going to help you drive the outcome. So I think that's a really powerful North Star message to have as you're getting buy-in for your assessment strategy within your organization. And that you're going to be balancing different criteria and different levels of validity depending on those outcomes. True North Stars, you want to have a valid assessment, obviously, but there's going to be times where you might be leaning more on perceptual data, which can be really powerful for the use of development, for example. But if you're going to be using that data for selection decisions, you really want to be leaning on more objective tools. So that concept of validity and objectivity is also a common thread that you're going to be using to maybe make the right decision, again, based on that outcome. I think too, like this has become more and even more important. It's always been there, but it continues to be more important in organizations as we talked about. What is that experience for the leader going to be? And where is the organization in their assessment journey? Have they ever used assessments, or would this be a net new introduction of this concept into the organization? Because that's going to affect the messaging and the positioning. Versus, is there already assessment culture in place? But maybe what's the experience been? Has there been sort of good experiences around assessment, or has this been kind of sort of more of a black box or dark mark type of culture around assessments in the past that you're walking into? And so really keeping in mind, given the demands on leaders today, what is the experience they're going to have, and making sure that's set up in the right way and that you're coming in the right level of depth depending where you are in the journey, I think is another sort of good grounding principle to have, or like a red thread from that perspective.
Thanks, Patrick. And this next question is actually a good kind of deeper dive to that assessment culture, which is, what are some of the best ways to clarify the relationship and boundaries in terms of company processes and functions? Like, is it for evaluation? Is it for development? Is it succession planning? What advice can you share in terms of clarifying those roles and those processes?
Yeah. I think each of those discussions has to start with what's the primary problem you're trying to solve, right? So what is the problem that's keeping you up at night with your leaders that you're trying to solve with an assessment? Like starting there. And then that gives you a good platform to dive deeper, right? So if it's more about, I have majority of my leaders are going to be retiring here in the next 10 years. And I do not feel confident in the pipeline of talent that's going to step into those roles. Well, that leads you to more of a succession need. And that's going to require more in-depth and definitely objective assessments versus, I really need to get leaders excited about development. Right now, it feels like a chore. It feels like a check the box. And there are clear gaps that I need to close with a particular population, and I need to get them engaged around that. then you could probably lean on something that maybe is going to be it could be a bit lighter touch, but a bit more engaging that would start to bring them into the journey that you could then build on. So I think it has to start with the problem, like what's keeping you up at night for that business leader? How's that impacting the goals that business leader or function is trying to solve? And then from there, being able to recommend solutions that are going to tie back to those. I think starting the conversation there is just sort of the ultimate, where you're going to know where to anchor it, and then you can build out from there. That's a great question.
Thanks, Patrick. A couple of deeper dive questions here. There was a follow-up question around the use of personality inventories for frontline leaders as well. Is that something that you would suggest?
It's definitely a use there, because again, it gets at natural leadership tendencies. The key with any type of personality assessment that again is more robust, and again it has some more validity behind it, is it's paired with really good feedback, because there's a risk of that person making, again, maybe incorrect assumptions about that insight that actually are not right. And so having a trained feedback provider to be able to provide the right level of coaching and guidance, make sure they walk away rather with the right level of insight that's accurate. That's critical too at the frontline level. And sometimes there's a risk, sometimes because those populations are larger, to maybe not put as much rigor behind that. So if it is going to be more of a deeper depth personality tool, you got to think about pairing that with the right level of feedback, versus if it's more of a self-perception tool about their personality that's lighter touch, you don't need to necessarily have that level of feedback on the back end, and that's more scalable. So I think there's a place for it. You just have to think through what's the right level of depth that you want to drive at that audience, and how many leaders are you trying to touch as well, because it can be, that level of insight can be powerful. But it has to be paired with the right level of support and feedback on the back end, especially if you're using a pretty robust personality inventory.
Thanks. And then I think this is time for our last question here, which is around 360s. I think there was a good discussion too around clarifying the validity of 360s. Is it low? Is it high? And if so, if you can define that a little bit further.
Yeah, 360s have a definite seat at the table. They just, and don't misunderstand me there too, which is they add a lot of value because they tend to be more holistic, and they give you really strong read on perceptions from multiple lenses, like we talked about. The caution is they are subjective, right? So they're based on people's perceptions, which is not always reality, right? So that needs to be taken into account. And it is a lens on current performance. It's not a lens on future performance. So that's where the caution of making sure you're using it strictly for development, but not using it for instance, purposes like succession, where it's more about what's the person's future capability, not their current performance as well. A really important caution too about 360s is the well can be poisoned really easily if it's misused. So word will get out quickly if a 360 is being used for anything beyond development. Like if it was rumors that it was used around someone for a selection decision, that they felt like that was the data point that maybe it was a reason they didn't get that job, or it's only administered when there's a performance issue. And so it becomes like a bad thing versus an opportunity for self-insight that's paired with broader development. So it's hard to get the toothpaste back in the tube once that happens, right? So it's really important to think about making sure that organizations stay true to using it just for development, and that they're transparent with leaders around that's the approach that's taking, and that you stick to that. Because if it starts to get misused, it can, as I said, poison the well, and then it affects the data people are willing to provide. They're not willing to be as honest, for example, in the feedback they're providing in those surveys. And so then you lose the accuracy, the relevance, all those pieces sort of go out the window. So again, very powerful. They just need to be used in the right way.
There's one last question that came in that I thought helps round us up here, which is, when researching assessments, how do you assess the validity of each? I saw a number of people saying that they're looking at different tools. So how would you assess for validity?
Yeah, you need, it sounds really basic, but first start with just asking for it, right? So as I said, when there's good validity evidence for assessment tools, that particular organization is very willing to share that, to be transparent around it, to show it off, really. So one is asking for it, and that should be documented in some type of technical report or a technical summary, so you can get a read on that. There's also different types of validity. I won't go into all the details around that today, but for instance, content validity. So how well does that assessment map onto the areas that are really going to be critical to measure for that, like a particular leader population, versus predictive validity? How well does an assessment predict future performance? And different types of assessments are going to rely on different types of validity as a primary indicator of how valid it is. And so thinking through those aspects, which should be highlighted also in a technical summary as well, is really important. So I'd say ask for it, and then your radar should sort of be up if it's hard to get that information, or feels like there's sort of a roundabout explanation around it. That can be a bit of a red flag. So something to keep in mind as you're kind of navigating that validity topic. These are great questions. I can tell you all are in the thick of it right now around sorting this through. And again, it's a fun topic. There's just lots of avenues and there's potential pitfalls there. So I hope this was helpful around thinking through that. Again, that cheat sheet I think could also be really helpful as you're starting to kind of think about the differences and the types of criteria. And we're more than happy to talk more to you about that as well, either at the summit, or if you want to, please feel free to reach out to us to continue those conversations. But thanks for the engagement today. Thanks for having a little fun with us too, and for the good questions. Really hope this was a value add for you, and I hope you have a good rest of your afternoon or evening. Thanks, everybody.